Here's a quick, thought-provoking question. When was the last time you heard anyone mention the game franchise Worms? Now, for the few of you who have ties to the series, and maybe know a couple people who are also into it, it may not have been long since you've heard of it. But for the average human, it's got to have been decades since we've last heard anyone say worms. And no, I'm not talking about those weird-looking things that live in the ground. Well, I kind of am, but, you know, more virtually. This has got to be one of my favourite game franchises of all time. I mean, you know, it's hard not to be, with each experience being more refined than the last. It's basically just a 2D or 3D strategy game where you and your friends, or you and your no one, go head to head with one another in a valiant attempt to be the last worm standing. It usually ends with arguments about how the game was rigged from the very beginning, you know, just because you got unlucky with your spawn. And although that may be true, you all know deep down that you had an absolute blast. And the reason I'm making this video isn't to make some shabby review about a game from over a decade ago. It's actually instead centered around the question, what happened to this franchise? Because around the 2000s and 2010s, these games were everywhere, sometimes releasing more than one game a year. But as of right now, the last game we got was Worms Rumble back in 2020. And although to a Skylanders fan that may not sound like that long ago, but for a game franchise that was cranking these games out faster than the Saw films, it is pretty weird to see a gap like this occur. And something even more surprising is the gap between Worms Rumble and WMD, being a whopping 3 years in total, which by the way is the longest gap the series has ever had since it first started back in 1995. So what exactly happened to this franchise, I hear you asking? Well, if you'll please indulge me, grab a drink, subscribe to the channel, please, and while you're at it, you might as well grab your copy of Worms Ultimate Mayhem, because that game is absolutely incredible. The year is 1990, and certified nerd Andy Davidson had just started production on a game he referred to as Artillery. Being an avid tech whiz and all, Davidson managed to somehow rip and utilise the graphics from Lemmings, which meant he was able to use them freely at his disposal while developing his initial ideas. At this point, the project was nothing more than a bit of fun with his friends, but after seeing the overwhelmingly positive reception to the game's release, Andy wanted to take it a step higher. Obviously he knew that if he was serious about the game, he couldn't just stick with using Lemmings assets, and that's why he set out, and probably from the creative bowels of his brain, he made Worm. And after tightening a few loose ends, such as changing the name of the project to Total Wormage, he thought the game was just about good enough to be entered into a publishing competition, held by then popular magazine Amiga Format. He didn't win the competition, obviously, nor did he get enough publicity to get his idea picked up by any developers. But good old Andy wasn't going to take no for an answer, so in a fit of dedication and perseverance, Andy took his idea to a London-based trade show, and it was there where Andy met someone by the name of Martin Brown, who was not only the co-founder of Team 17, but also offered to develop and publish his idea. And before you knew it, the game released for a wide variety of consoles just in time for the holiday season back in 1995. Fast forward now into everyone's favourite year, 2003. The franchise by this point has basically seen it all. Spin-offs, polarising reviews, and what many people would consider the peak of the series, that being in the form of Worms Armageddon. But the year 2003 in particular saw the franchise delve into uncharted waters. Now, instead of just roaming around some yucky 2D battlefield, you can now move your worm on a whole other axis. This was an incredible step in the right direction for the franchise. And I mean, sure, there were some die-hard Worms fans out there who weren't even willing to give these 3D games a shot, but at least to me, this is where the franchise was at an all-time high. Maybe it was the colour palette that was so in-your-face and obnoxious, yet you still chose to love it anyway. Or maybe it was the charming graphics that just screamed GameCube. Or maybe even the variety of different modes, like the multiplayer for example, that constantly brought players excessive glee. But at the end of the day, we all know it was by combining all those minute details into one heaping pile of joy. So now we're going to take quite a drastic jump from the year 2003 all the way to 2020. This year saw the release of nobody's favourite game, Worms Rumble. The reason it's nobody's favourite game is mainly due to the fact that it took away the turn-based elements that made Worms such a special franchise to begin with. It was clear from the get-go that Team 17 was just trying to, you know, cash in on a huge genre at the time by using one of their bigger IPs, which is a real shame, you know, considering a strategy game like Worms was near perfect for a year like 2020. Everyone was stuck in their homes with little to do, and I know for sure that me and my friends would have got together to have a few rounds of Worms. In fact, we did end up sinking quite a lot of time into Worms Ultimate Mayhem, just to keep ourselves sane during lockdown. And not only is Worms Rumble not a very good game, but it's also not a very good game. From the moment I started playing and had a couple rounds, I knew for a fact I wasn't going to be booting it back up again. And apparently that was the mindset for pretty much everyone who also booted this game up. Because of right now, you'd be lucky if you got into a server with over 10 players. And yes, that is including cross-platform. And that, my friends, is what we in the business call worms. Well, you know, a few of them at least. There were obviously a ton more of these games I missed out, like Worms Golf and whatever this Bust a Move ripoff was. And as I mentioned before, these games were kind of like parasites in the game industry, constantly being churned out faster than anyone could imagine. And although most of these games were met with decent reception, everyone just kind of lost interest after a while. People started to realise that they were all kind of samey, and that's by no means a cheap attempt at trying to discount any of the new features and game modes every entry brought in. But each game just kind of felt like a more refined version of the last, which is definitely and obviously a positive. Wait, you're telling me there's a series that's constantly improving with every rapid fire entry? Where do I sign up? But the point I'm trying to make is that in order for you to make a successful series, you're going to have to bring in standout defining features. For example, I genuinely couldn't tell you the differences between Worms Game A and Worms Game B. And I don't mean for this to come across as a negative, but it is a very one-note franchise. And don't get me wrong, it is a really good note, and it does play it super well. But cranking out over 20 games, with each one offering a similar experience, it just kind of feels like a waste to me. Personally, I do think Worms is a pretty good example of when it comes to game companies and how they treat their popular IPs. Like, should they stop making games when people still want more, running the risk of not milking their cash cow to its full potential, but also having to deal with the backlash that is customer dissatisfaction? Or should you stop when nobody wants more, and risk running the IP into the ground and tarnishing its reputation for good? Honestly, I couldn't fully tell you since, you know, I don't have a business degree, but I would like to hear your thoughts in the comments. It doesn't have to be centered around Worms, I was just kind of using that as an example. Anyway, Happy New Year everyone. My goal for last year was to hit 100 subscribers, so getting 780 is just wow. I guess for this year my goal is to hit 1,000, so if you can, it would really mean a lot to me if you did subscribe to the channel. But yeah, I hope you have a good 2024, and I'll see you either never again or, you know, when I'm not procrastinating.